welcome back. We are here at topic 5.2 in chapter 5. We're going to be dealing with the limits to the growth of populations. And when we deal with limits to the growth of populations, we're going to be talking about a number of different things. But first, let's talk about what exactly a population is and how they are distributed. A population is defined as a group of organisms of the same species that inhabits a defined geographic area at the same time. So generally, individuals will breed with one another, they'll rely on the same resources to live, and they are influenced by the same factors in their environment. A couple of important characteristics of populations are the density of the population and how the population is dispersed. Population density is the number of individuals of a population that inhabit a certain unit of land or water area. An example of population density would be the number of squirrels that inhabit a particular forest. Another thing that's important is population dispersion, and that's a little more complicated. This is how individuals of a population are spaced within a region. There are three main ways in which populations of species can be dispersed. Those three ways are random, clumping, and uniform. And I will tell you that most populations do live in clumps, but let's look at each one of those. Random, the example on the right-hand side with dandelions, is where the position of each individual isn't determined or influenced by the other members of the population. An example again here is with dandelions. They're interspersed in fields or forests. The location of their growth is random and relative to other species, not their own population. So this type of dispersion is relatively uncommon. Let's take a look at uniform, the creosote bush in the center there. The members of the population are uniformly spaced throughout their geographic region. This is seen in forests or in deserts, like you see here, in where trees are uniformly distributed so that each receives adequate light and water, for example. So these creosote bushes are dispersed in such a way so that each one of them is getting the same amount of resources underneath the ground, same amount of sunlight, same amount of water, so they're really not competing with each other at all for resources. Uniform dispersion is often the result of competition for resources in an ecosystem. And then finally, we've got clumped. Okay, and clumping is the most common dispersion pattern for populations. In this type of dispersion, individuals kind of flock together. This makes sense for a lot of species. Certain plants will all grow together in a region that suits their requirements for life. Fish will wind up swimming in schools to avoid predation, and birds and many other animals migrate in groups. So one of the things about clumping, a couple of things you need to remember. The resources that a species needs, it varies greatly in availability from place to place. So the species will tend to cluster in areas where the resources are available. And secondly, individuals moving in groups have a better chance of encountering patches or clumps of resources like water or vegetation than they would searching for the resources on their own. Third, living in groups can help protect some individuals from predators. And fourth, living in packs gives some predator species a better chance of getting a meal. So in this case, if you think about a pride of lions, a lion on its own is less likely to get a meal than a pack or a pride of lions because those lions can hunt together. So some variables that govern changes in population size. And really the four things, when you think about it, they're really quite simple. So how is a population going to grow? Well, first you got to look at the births in the population. You also have to look at the deaths in a population. You have to look at immigration, and you also have to look at emigration. So if you were putting this all together in a kind of a math equation, basically you would say is that population change is equal to the births and the immigration together subtracted by the deaths and the emigration together. Fairly simple concept, but something you might want to think about. So let's look at the structure of ages in a population. Basically, the age structure is the distribution of individuals among various age groups. It can certainly have a big effect on how quickly a population will increase or decrease in size. So a couple of things to think about is grouping populations in terms of their ability to reproduce. So you've got the pre-reproductive age, where you've got individuals in a population that are not mature enough to reproduce. You've got the reproductive age, where all those members of that segment of the population are capable of reproduction, and then the post-reproductive age, where they're too old to reproduce. So taking a look at a range of tolerance, and things that can limit the size of a population. So there are certainly factors in each habitat or ecosystem that can put a limit on how quickly population can grow. So obviously, different species are going to thrive under different conditions. So there is a range of tolerance to variations in its physical and chemical environment that is there for every single population. Here's an example that comes from your book on page 113. So what we're looking at here is we're looking at the range of tolerance for a population of trout to a physical environmental factor. In this case, we're dealing with water temperature. So basically what happens is the range of tolerance restrictions prevent particular species from taking over an ecosystem by keeping their size in check. So the optimal range here in the center is temperatures that are not too hot and they're not too cold. So that's where you're going to have a large abundance of organisms. So there are zones outside of that of physiological stress where the temperature is a little too high. Couple of organisms can survive there. And then on the far left, there's temperatures where they're a little too low. Again, a couple organisms can survive there. But you see those dashed lines on the left and the right. Those are the limits of tolerance. So any temperature below that lower limit of tolerance, these trout can't survive. Temperatures above that higher limit of tolerance, those trout can't survive in those environments. A lot of times it's not just one factor that can be a limiting factor. Some limiting factors, we'll go over them here in a minute, but basically what these limiting factors together kind of come up with this limiting factor principle, which basically says what we just described here in this diagram. Too much or too little of any chemical or physical factor can certainly limit or prevent growth of a population, even if everything else is within this optimum range. So you could have great temperatures, but maybe salinity is too high or salinity is too low. Maybe dissolved oxygen is not high enough or it's too low. So there are a number of things, even if everything else is perfect, there are a number of things that can come into play to where there can be a limit on growth. Taking a look at density dependent and density independent factors when it comes to looking at populations. Population limiting factors, like we just talked about, a lot of them can be purely the result of the size of the population itself. And this is something we need to think about when we start thinking about the human population. For example, in many populations of species in nature, birth and death rates are certainly influenced by the density of the population. Other density dependent factors that could influence the size of a population are increased predation, which can happen because there are more members of the population to attract predators, competition for food or living space, disease, which can spread more rapidly in overcrowded populations, and think about the buildup of toxic materials. If you've got disease spreading or lots of toxicity, that can certainly affect a greater number of individuals in a population, especially if they're densely packed. Some population limiting factors can operate independently of the population size. These are density independent factors. It doesn't matter whether the population is large or small. Independent factors could include things like fire, storms, earthquakes, other catastrophic events. Those are definitely density independent factors. And then taking a look at some of these limiting factors for organisms that live on land or in aquatic life zones. On land, certainly precipitation is a limiting factor. And when you're dealing with some plant species, too much water can be a limiting factor. Too much fertilizer can be a limiting factor. And obviously, temperature is a major limiting factor. I mean, the biomes themselves are really made up of temperature and precipitation. That's climate. But when you're dealing with aquatic life zones, these four things here are certainly major limiting factors. The temperature of the water, the amount of sunlight that penetrates the surface, and how far it goes down, what kind of nutrients are available. And then, of course, we also talked about the dissolved oxygen content. So taking a look here, looking at environmental resistance and carrying capacity as we kind of move on into on page 114 in your book. Eventually a population is going to reach some size limit that's basically imposed by a limiting factor or two or three. And if the limiting factor is there and it's pretty strict, if a population gets too high, eventually there's going to wind up being a dieback because the competition for resources is really, really going to intensify. Something to remember, there's always a limit to population growth in nature. The biotic potential of a population is never really going to be realized because a population is never going to be in a situation where unlimited resources are available in its environment. So that's why the biotic potential is never realized. So basically, what we have to figure out is, all right, we look at environmental resistance, all the factors that limit growth, based on the population, based on the resources available, and we come up with an area's carrying capacity. And the carrying capacity of an area is defined as the maximum population size that can sustainably be supported by the available resources in the region. So let's take a look at a couple of population growth curves. Okay, so on the left we've got exponential growth, and with exponential growth, what we're dealing with is unlimited growth. Okay, so we haven't really reached any limits to we haven't reached any limiting factors that is going to wind up slowing the growth rate down. As you can see, looking at the graph on the left, it's going to start slowly, but then it's going to accelerate as the population increases, because basically what's happening is the base size of the population is increasing. So when you plot the number of individuals against time, it will give you this J-shaped curve. But usually what we'll see is we will wind up seeing this exponential growth followed by logistic population growth. And this really is what exists in natural settings. This model basically says that when populations are well below the size dictated by the carrying capacity of the region they live in, they're going to grow exponentially until they reach that limiting factor, until they reach that number that can be the maximum number that can be supported by an environment. But when they approach the carrying capacity, the growth rate will decrease and the size of the population will eventually stabilize. So as we see here is a logistic population growth curve. And from your book, they actually show one that's probably a little bit more realistic. It's not going to even off just like that. What's going to happen is you see exponential growth there on the left that approaches the carrying capacity, and then there's some environmental resistance and some fluctuation until finally the population stabilizes. So let's take a look at some of the population controls, again, in nature. I do recommend to you that you pay close attention to the two case studies that are inside this chapter. One is on page 114, and really at the beginning of the chapter too. They talk about sea otters and the uncertain future facing sea otters. And then they also talk about the exploding white-tailed deer population in the United States, beginning on page 115. You really get a really good sense of population crashes, as well as some stabilization of population, and then just a population that is growing exponentially and pretty out of control. So what really does happen when carrying capacity is overshot? They talk about it a little bit in your book, beginning on page 116. When a population exceeds its carrying capacity, it can crash. So what we're looking at here is a population crash of reindeer, and this is a diagram on page 116 in your book. So it tracks the exponential growth, the overshoot, and then eventually the population crash of reindeer that was introduced onto the small Bering Sea island of St. Paul. So basically what happened here, you had 26 reindeer, 24 of them were female. They were introduced in 1910. All kinds of food sources were everywhere. They were totally plentiful. Within 25 years, the herd size had actually grown to 2,000, and it overshot the island's carrying capacity. So what happened was it led to a population crash, and the herd size actually crashed all the way down to 8 reindeer by 1950. So you see this exponential growth because of the abundance of resources, but then you have the overuse and intense competition for resources, and then the population crashes. So 25 years to reach the major overshot, and only 15 years to really crash and die back. One of the things that we can begin to talk about in terms of stabilization of population and some controls on population and how populations actually do grow and how populations do actually continue on is some reproductive, I don't want to say I mean, I said strategies at the beginning of on the slide, but just kind of reproductive methods. So one of the things that your book talks about is it talks about algae, bacteria, insects, organisms like that, comparing them to mammals. Um, Basically, different reproductive patterns will help ensure a species long-term survival. So species like algae, bacteria, insects have a lot of small offspring, and they really don't have to give them any parental care or protection. Basically, these kinds of species will overcome massive losses of offspring by producing so many that a few are going to survive and continue to go on and produce a lot of offspring. With mammals, however, the mammals have a reproductive strategy where the uh, the young develop inside their mothers where they're safe. They are born fairly large. After birth, they're going to mature slowly. They're cared for and protected by one or both parents. In some cases, they live in herds or groups until they reach reproductive age, and then the cycle begins again. A lot of large mammals, elephants, whales, humans, um, they follow this reproductive pattern, and a lot of these species, especially those with long times between generations and with low reproductive rates, we read about sharks and their low reproductive rate. Um, they're really vulnerable to extinction because of that long period of time in between reproductive cycles. So when we look at variations in population size and kind of how they go about changing, the general patterns of variation are very simple. You've got a stable population size, you've got an eruptive population size, you've got cyclic population, and then you've got irregular population. So a stable population, it fluctuates slightly above and below in its carrying capacity, so it's very stable. So it's already gone through that J-shaped portion. It's reached the period of environmental resistance, and now it's stabilized. It's characteristic of a lot of species that are found in undisturbed tropical rainforests, where the environmental conditions really don't change year to year. For many species, population growth can occasionally surge or erupt, IRRUPT, to a high peak and then crash to a more stable level. Or to a very low unstable level. So basically, what you have is you've got these short-lived, rapidly reproducing species like algae, lots of insects. They have eruptive cycles, and those are usually linked to seasonal changes in weather or seasonal changes in nutrient availability. Um, in some temperate climates, like what we have, insect populations grow so quick during the spring and summer, and then they crash during the wintertime. A third type of fluctuation consists of cyclic fluctuations or boom and bust cycles of population over a time period. An example of this are lemmings, whose populations rise and fall every 3 to 4 years, and lynx and snowshoe hare, whose populations generally rise and fall in 10-year cycles, as you can see here in this diagram. So over those cyclic periods, you see these boom and bust time frames. And then finally, you've got populations that appear to have irregular changes in size with really no recurring pattern. Basically, scientists will attribute this irregularity to chaos in systems. Basically, it could just represent fluctuations in response to catastrophic population crashes from severe winter weather. Now, one thing I do want you to keep in mind is that humans are not exempt from nature's population controls. We've seen a number of things in human history to where there's been major die-offs. The Irish potato famine, the Black Plague, and currently, you've got a lot of adult HIV prevalence going on in continents like Africa and in other parts of the world. So humans are certainly not exempt or immune from nature's population controls. That's certainly one thing to keep in mind. Well, that's all I have for you for topic 5.2. Be sure to take the quiz. I will link the quiz underneath the embedded video here on the Google site, and I will be working on topic 5.3 and finishing that up for you. Talk with you soon.